To objectively define when moral status begins, we must set aside emotional arguments and rely on strict empirical data. We cannot rely on assumptions to understand human value. We must first establish the empirical biological facts and then apply objective ontological logic to those facts. We map this process by examining two distinct disciplines, empirical biology and ontological philosophy. The first phase strictly defines what biological science observes about human development from its origin. The second phase applies philosophical frameworks to interpret those facts, determining ethical value. The core question is precise. Does human value come from an entity's inherent nature, or does it depend on what that entity can physically do? Answering this requires treating human identity as a specific biological and logical mechanism that can be precisely mapped. We begin with the empirical biology phase, looking at the absolute beginning of human development. The microscopic moment of fertilization is known as syngamy. When male and female haploid gametes fuse, each brings exactly half the necessary chromosomes to instantly create a complete 46-chromosome genome. The resulting single-cell zygote contains a unique genetic code entirely distinct from both of its parents. As developmental anatomists Moore and Persad state in The Developing Human, this cell marks the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. This genetic origin point leads to the observation of epigenetic continuity. The continuous biological developments of an organism is known as ontogeny. From the zygote stage onward, the organism does not undergo sudden ontological leaps where it physically transforms into something biologically different. According to Larson's Human Embryology, this development is a continuous process where the organism executes its own internal genetic program. From the precise moment of syngamy, empirical biology defines the entity as an already unfolding, continuously developing human organism rather than a passive clump of raw material. Let's address a common biological misconception by examining how the early embryo, or conceptus, interacts with its maternal environment. The conceptus is often incorrectly viewed as a passive parasite. In reality, it operates as an active biological agent, orchestrating its own survival. It produces specific biochemical signals, such as early pregnancy factor, that actively force the mother's physiology to adapt and sustain its growth. Sadler's medical embryology confirms this, noting the zygote initiates its own developmental sequence and modulates maternal physiological responses immediately upon implantation. The conceptus maintains its own distinct cell lineages and circulatory precursors, ensuring physiological and immunological independence from the outset. Embryologists O'Reilly and Mueller classify it as an independent biological entity operating in a shared environment, not as a constituent organ belonging to the mother. This active biological independence is driven by active potentiality. Uncombined gametes require an outside force to join them. The zygote, however, possesses an intrinsic internal engine driving its own maturity. Empirical science proves the unborn entity is an autonomous, self-directing human organism. This completes the physical half of the proof. With biology establishing exactly what the organism is, we move to the philosophical logic gates to determine its moral worth. This transitions us into the substance view of persons.
This view hinges on primary substance, what an entity is by its very nature, regardless of its current stage of development. The core axiom here is that moral worth is grounded entirely in possessing a human nature, not in a current capacity to perform functions, think, or feel. Philosophers Moreland and Ray articulate this by stating that intrinsic value is based on what an entity is by nature, rather than what it can currently perform. We can map the biological concept of active potentiality directly to this philosophical framework. Gametes are passive building materials waiting for a builder. The zygote is the active builder already assembling itself. Because the human embryo already possesses the internal principle for its own actualization, ethicist David Oderberg notes that its moral status is fully present from conception. If true human rights are derived from what you are, your primary substance, rather than what you can do, then complete moral status exists fully at the single-cell stage. The opposing view often assigns personhood based on developmental milestones, such as a heartbeat, brain activity or viability outside the womb. This visual represents the principle of developmental continuity. Biological growth is a smooth, continuous process. Drawing a sudden line where a non-person magically becomes a person lacks logical or rational justification. Scholars George and Tollefson reinforce that human development is a self-directed, unbroken continuum from the zygote forward. Milestone markers are arbitrarily imposed. Conditioning moral value on variable functional traits, like self-awareness, intelligence, or communicative ability, is an ethical trap known as functionalism. If human rights depend strictly on functional performance, logical consistency dictates that infants, the comatose, and the severely cognitively disabled would also forfeit their right to life. To counter this, we apply the concept of ontological identity through time. The adult human watching this video is numerically identical to the exact embryo they once were. As Francis Beckwith explains, no new subject of experience was ever swapped in during development. The original subject simply grew. To destroy that early entity is to destroy the person. To avoid an ethical collapse where human rights are granted and revoked based on utility, moral equality must be anchored in the objective reality of human nature established at conception. When empirical facts and philosophical logic are fully aligned, they produce a singular, unified result. Premise 1. Empirical embryology proves the unborn entity is an autonomous, genetically unique, and continuously developing living human organism from the exact moment of fertilization. Premise 2. The principles of active potentiality and the substance view logically establish that this living organism inherently possesses full moral status and ontological personhood. The objective moral and legal parameters of murder are defined as the intentional, unlawful taking of an innocent human life that possesses full moral standing. Because prenatal life satisfies every biological and philosophical criterion of human personhood, its deliberate termination fulfills all necessary conditions and constitutes murder. This classification is not derived from subjective belief, emotion, or shifting cultural norms. It is the direct result of rigorous academic analysis. Acknowledging human rights requires submitting to the objective reality of when human life begins.